Apparently this was no laughing matter for Her Majesty the Queen, or as she then was, Princess Elizabeth. Oh yes, let me explain. Morning, nice to see you today, and as ever thank you for joining me on a very special report. I love sharing these stories with you about the early part of the monarchy, or indeed stories that are not shown a light on for many years, simply because when you think about it, the world of show business and royalty has been sort of twinned forever, ever since the court gesture, popping onto the floor in front of the reigning monarch with his mandolin and of course his wonderful ditties that apparently cheered them up, until of course the monarch of the time got fed up and sent them off to the Tower. Possibly a way to be, particularly with my act. I wouldn't have lasted too long, I can recall, but there you go. Now if you cast your mind back to 1950, I know all of us are too young to remember that, but it was a prestigious time, particularly in the world of entertainment, and particularly if you were lucky enough to get invited to appear at the Royal Variety Show. Now, the Royal Variety Show, as many people know, is all put together, all thanks to an idea from Edward VII, way back in the 1911-1910 period, where he saw that people who had been music hall stars were truly struggling after their star had waned, and they didn't necessarily save the money. So he wanted something like a benevolent fund where that could fund them. After all, as he said, they'd given so many people so much pleasure and entertainment. A wonderful gesture that continues to this day. And the very first Royal Variety took place at the Palace Theatre in 1912. But back to 1950. In attendance that night at the London Palladium was none other than the Princess Elizabeth, alongside King George and what we now know to be, of course, our wonderful Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth. And what's interesting about that particular sort of show, or that particular period, there was so much talent to pick from, literally across the pond and over here in the United Kingdom. There was so much talent, as I say, that was put forward to the royals and said, would you like this? And as I've told you before, you see, some of the favourite comedians of the royalty tend to be a little bit, shall we say, saucy, not at all what you would imagine. Perhaps you've no idea that, in fact, the Duke of Edinburgh was a big fan of a good friend of mine, Bernard Manning. And although Bernard didn't really get his moment to shine in front of royalty, he certainly was a favourite with the Duke of Edinburgh, simply because he says all the wrong things at all the right times. You get the picture. But back to 1950, one of the biggest stars on the planet of that year was none other than the wonderful comedian and violin player, Jack Benny. Now, Jack had come over specially, and even though he's known for his meanness, they didn't pay him any money. The flights, the hotel at the Dorchester, everything was brought by himself. Also on the bill was another royal favourite, a British comedian from Brighton, the cheeky chappie himself, Max Miller. Now, what really went on behind the scenes of the Royal Variety in 1950 was simply this. You see, you get an allotted time, and on that allotted time, if you overrun, particularly if you are the producer, Val Parnell, the impresario behind the world-famous Ace Variety Theatre, the London Palladium, obviously you don't want to cross him. What's interesting here is that Jack Benny was going so well, he literally overran. But Val Parnell, knowing of course he was a huge US star, said nothing and basically cut down the British comedian Max Miller. Max Miller ignored that because he was going well too, getting lots of laughs from the gallery and the royal box. What happened was, when he came off, the producer said to him, "You'll never work in one of my theatres again." Max famously retorted, "You're about £60,000 too late. Basically, stuff it," or words to that effect. What actually happened behind the scenes to reinstate Max Miller back to the mighty Moss Empire circuit was in fact His Majesty the King, King George. He was a huge fan of Max Miller, heard about this particular, argument behind the scenes, and decided to very politely, discreetly intervene. Princess Elizabeth was the one that actually reached out to the Palladium boss and said, please don't ban Max, His Majesty loves his comedy and would no doubt at some point like to invite him back to Windsor Castle for a private performance. Of course, Jack Benny also sided with Max Miller, saying, listen, we've got no beef between us, we're two comedians from the opposite side of the pond, it's not really a problem for either of us. Max Miller didn't know this intervention for many years to come. Fascinating when you think. But when you also think as well, Backstage at the London Palladium in 1950 for the Royal Variety performance, Max Miller must have truly thought his major career performing in front of royals was over. But it's all thanks to making the royals laugh that they very discreetly, very quietly reinstated a British comedy legend, and of course enjoyed the many, many laughs of the brilliant and wonderful Jack Benny too. Neil Sean in the very heart of London.